Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to take a look at, once again, at the Illuminati, vaguely, but I'll be focusing mainly on communism and socialism and the real agenda behind the promotion of these political ideologies in Russia, and now the so-called globalist Illuminati syndicate or group or whatever you want to call it has manipulated the mindset of society into thinking that somehow that the West was against communism. In the open, yes, and in the public view, that's what people perceive. But I'll be looking at some information which shows that secretly the West was funding, certain people within the West was funding these ideologies for their own purposes, their own globalist purposes. So that's what I'll be looking at today. So let's start looking at this subject now. So looking at the Russian Revolution, I'll be looking at the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and breaking that down, and you'll see the financial resources that went into these so-called revolutions and where that financing came from, and what the agenda of the people who were financing the Russian Revolution in particular was or is. Anyway, most of the information is coming from a book called, none dare call it a conspiracy. It's looking at the Federal Reserve, looking at communism, socialism, and this idea that there was a conspiracy to promote these political ideologies in Eastern Europe and Russia back in the at the beginning of the 1900s, or even going back to late 1800s. We're talking about Marx and Lenin and their political ideologies that the West helped to promote. So I'll be just taking extracts from the book, basically, providing information about what was going on at the time. So, and remembering that it wasn't just the communist Russia and say China that followed this socialist idea. You had the so-called developing countries around the world, like across Africa and the global south in general, that were borrowing from these socialist ideas, and they were influenced by Russia. So you'll find an agenda basically to promote these Western particular socialist ideologies across the world through promoting what you might call an alternative view of the world, or an alternative view to the Western capitalist system. So what I'll be also discussing is this idea that the West, instead of allowing a genuine alternative way of thinking to develop in the global south or other parts of the world, their idea is to create the alternative. So once you create the alternative that the global south also adheres to, because they genuinely think it's an alternative to the Western way of thinking, in reality the West has created an alternative for others to follow, so it's controlling both sides basically. Anyway, let me start looking at this. What I'll be looking at is the broader globalist agenda at first. Then I'll be looking at the funding for the communists and the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'll take a look at the central banks and the idea behind having a central bank and how it benefits the globalists, and then touch on wars for profit as well. So anyway, let me look at the first extract. What did these people possibly have to gain in financing the Russian Revolution? What did they have to gain by keeping it alive and afloat? Or during the 1920s by pouring millions of dollars into what Lenin called his new economic program, thus saving the Soviets from collapse. So when the Soviet Union formed, they didn't have a lot of money, even though the revolution was financed by certain bankers. They didn't have a lot of money. Officially, they were not receiving money, but secretly from these bankers and capitalists, they were receiving funding. Why would these capitalists do all this? If your goal is to is global conquest. You have to start somewhere. It may or may not have been coincidental, but Russia was the one major European country without a central bank. In Russia, for the first time, the communist conspiracy gained a geographical homeland from which to launch assaults against other nations. The West now had an enemy, yet it's the West who created the enemy, secretly. Going on, this talks about the same conspiracy on a broader scale. It is at this point that we should again make it clear that the conspiracy is not made up solely of bankers and international cartelists, but includes every field of human endeavor, starting with Voltaire and Adam Weishaupt. This Adam Weishaupt is the one who started the Illuminati in Bavaria in Germany in 1776, I think he was. He was a former Jesuit, but when the order was banned in Germany, he then formed the Illuminati, and this organization called the Illuminati influenced even the Freemasons. They formed their own organization. Even after they were banned, they formed secret organizations. So people think that the Illuminati was banned and that was the end of it. It actually continued under different names, and it infiltrated many of these so-called secret societies and other organizations. Anyway, and on to the present with Henry Kissinger and John Galbraith. It has always been the scholar looking for avenues of power who has shown the sons of the very powerful how their wealth could be used to rule the world. So it's basically the intellectuals in society, certain intellectuals, I should say, who along with the wealthy in society, who have used their intelligence to find ways of manipulating society to gain what they want from it. Now, looking at this socialist agenda in general, there are 3 points I'm going to mention here in a minute, but I'll just read this first part. If you study Marx' Communist Manifesto, you'll find that in essence, Marx said the proletariat revolution would establish the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. To achieve the socialist dictatorship of proletariat, 3 things would have to be accomplished: the elimination of all rights to private property, the dissolution of the family unit, and 3, the destruction of what Marx referred to as the opiate of the people, religion. And these are the same things that the Illuminati, this Adam Weishaupt, also wants to get rid of: the idea of personal property and the family unit. The family unit, the idea of getting rid of the family is that because the family is seen as something that the individual can focus on, and it creates an egotistical mindset basically in the individual, same as the nation state. The nation state, according to the Illuminati, is also something that creates an egotistical mindset in the individual. The individual for them is supposed to focus on the broader global human community, rather than focus on their own family or their own nation or their own community. It's supposed to be they're supposed to focus on a global scale, or look at their contribution to the world in general rather than their contribution to the family. This one is the concept behind communism. Although communism focuses on the communal state, it also focuses on the wider world. So communism was influenced by this Illuminati thinking. So that's why the focus moves away from the family basically, also moves away from the ownership of property. Ownership of property also creates an egotistical mindset that you own something others don't own. Religion also is something seen as, could call it, yes, it's also an egotistical, because you're focusing on your religious community. So it's also something to focus the individual on a particular group as opposed to the global community. And let me continue. Marx went on to state that when the dictatorship of the proletariat had accomplished these 3 things throughout the world, and after some undetermined length of time, the all-powerful state would miraculously wither away and state socialism would give way to communism. So when they get rid of the family, get rid of property ownership, and get rid of religion, people would focus on the global community. That's in his narrow thinking, but getting rid of a family unit is very difficult. How do you get rid of a family when the mother gives birth to a child and they have to care for the child? And, well, both parents basically. How do you break that normal, organic form of living to create a system where the child is taken away from the parents at birth? And how does the mother nurture the child if the child is taken away from the mother? Unless they're talking about allowing the mother to nurture the child until the weaning ends, and then they take the child away from the mother. So you're creating an inorganic system, basically. The all-powerful state would, as I said, everything would be peace, sweetness, and light, and everybody would live happily ever after. But first, all communists must work to establish socialism. So this is the idea of socialism. The process of communism is to establish a socialist society according to their agenda. So communism is very much linked to this Illuminati program of global domination. So although they talk about a global community where everyone is supposedly equal, what they really want is a society where the wealthy dominate the poorer classes or the poorer people. Now, I'll be looking at the funding of this communist agenda and indicate some of the sources of the funding that they received during the early days, in particular, of communism. We do know this, however, a clique of American financiers not only helped to establish communism in Russia, but has striven mightily ever since to keep it alive. Ever since 1918, this clique has been engaged in transferring money and, probably more important, technical information to the Soviet Union. And it goes on here to say that obviously the Rockefellers are involved in this. But the Rockefellers apparently were not alone in financing the communist arm of the insiders conspiracy. According to Professor Sutton, there is a report in the State Department files that names Kuhn, Loeb and Co. That's one of the major financial houses in New York, as the financer of the first 5-year plan. See, this is just saying where you should find the source, the US State Department decimal, and it gives the details of where to find the file. And here it's talking about 2 Germans who financed the Russian Revolution. The 2 Germans most responsible for financing of Lenin and Marx were Max Warburg and a displaced Russian named Alexander Elphand. They could claim that they were serving their country's cause by helping and financing Lenin. However, these 2 German patriots neglected to mention to the Kaiser their plan to foment a communist revolution in Russia. So this Max Warburg is connected to one of the major New York banks. The picture that takes on another dimension when you consider that the brother of what Max Warburg was Paul Warburg, prime mover in establishing the Federal Reserve System, and who from his position on the Federal Reserve Board of Directors played a key role in financing the American war effort, thus the war effort of World War I. And from what I've read, the US was brought into the First World War by the Jewish Zionists. The British requested the Zionists to help them to bring the US into the war. And the agreement was, this Balfour Declaration was part of the agreement. They would help colonize Palestine and give that land to the Jews if the Jews or the Zionists helped to bring America into the First World War. Yeah, I'm looking at the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the best sources of information and financing of the Bolshevik Revolution is Tsarism and the Revolution by an important white Russian general named Arsen Digolovich, who was founder in France of the union of oppressed peoples. Continuing. This General Alexander Nekh-Volodov is quoted by de Gaulle as stating in his book on the Bolshevik Revolution. In April 1917, Jacob Schiff publicly declared that it was thanks to his financial support that the revolution in Russia had succeeded. In the spring of the same year, Schiff commenced to subsidize Trotsky. Simultaneously, Trotsky and co. were also being subsidized by Max Warburg and Olaf Ashberg of Nye Bank of Stockholm, the Rhine-Westphalian Syndicate, and Zhivotsky, whose daughter later married Trotsky. So there are different finances from around Europe and America that financed the Bolshevik Revolution. That's also part of the Russian Revolution. And more information again about the Bolshevik financing. Later evidence indicates that the bankrolling of the Bolsheviks was handled by a syndicate of international bankers, which in addition to the Schiff-Warburg clique included Morgan and Rockefeller interests. Documents show that the Morgan organization put at least $1 million in the Red Revolution kitty. So this goes on to talk about a wealthy Englishman named Lord Alfred Milner, the organizer and head of a secret organization called the Round Table, which was backed by the Lord Rothschild. So you're including the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, two well-known names in so-called conspiracy theories. Although it's not conspiracy, these are people who are well known to be financing their own certain interests. They finance, Rothschilds in particular, have financed both sides of World War I and World War II. They financed the Germans and the Allied and Americans and the British. So looking at this formation of the central bank, this concept of, which I'll mention in a minute, there are certain measures to establish the socialist society or socialist state. One of them is the formation of a national bank, and certain other things such as the getting rid of the family and such things. Anyway, I'll mention them in a minute. 2 months prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, the conspirators had created the mechanism to collect the funds to pay interest on the national debt. The mechanism was the progressive income tax. That's another thing, the income tax that we all pay out of our salaries in the West, what people pay in the West. It's part of this so-called socialist agenda. That's why in America, where they have a certain critique of socialism, there are certain things they don't want to have in their society, like paying tax. They see it as a communist ideology, even though it's their own people that brought the communist ideology to the West, to Eastern Europe and Russia. The mechanism was the progressive income tax, the second plank of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, which contained 10 planks for socializing a country. So in the West, they tend to have this dual perspective. You either have to be adhering to one ideology or the other, when in reality, what it takes to organize the society properly might require elements of both ideologies, like socialism and the income tax, something like that, which is people contributing to the running of their societies, is generally, in, say, in Europe and other regions of the world, it's perceived as something that is good for society, as opposed to in America, where people don't want to pay tax. They see it as the government taking their money, yet they want the infrastructure of the societies to exist. House authored a book, Philip Drew, the Administrator, in which he wrote of establishing socialism as a dream by Karl Marx. As steps towards this goal, House, both in his book and in real life, called for the passage of a graduated income tax and the central bank providing a flexible, inflatable paper currency. The graduated income tax and a central bank are 2 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. So the idea, if you want to have income tax and a central bank, these are communist ideas. In America, you have the Federal Reserve, which is seen as some kind of state bank, even though it's not actually owned by the state. So, which would mean that this is a communist, part of a communist agenda to have a central bank, and yet people accept the central bank as something that is normal in their society. So out of the 10 measures for socializing a country, one is the progressive or graduated income tax. Another one, the abolition of the rights of inheritance. And there are 10, I'm only mentioning 3 which are relevant to this, what I'm talking about today. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly by the state of the currency and the financial system. So those are 3. I don't know if I should mention some of the other points. No, there's one I want to mention. Let me have a look here. Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. This is part of the Communist Manifesto, yet most countries in the world have a system of free education. Even in the US, there's a certain amount of free education. And then back in the 18th century, there was child labor, which was abolished, and that abolition was part of a communist agenda. So there are certain things which align both with the communist or so-called socialist ideologies. You know, Western societies seem to feel the need that you have to have 2 opposing ways of looking at things, and those 2 opposing ways of looking at things can't blend, but in reality they do blend. A society isn't supposed to fix its way of looking at the world on one particular ideology, unless that ideology is more balanced, which most Western ideologies are not. They're either one extreme to or the other. That's why there's so much political problems in Western societies. Anyway, let me continue. That was looking at the central bank, the concept of a central bank, which if you look at the Federal Reserve in the US, which is a private bank, it was formed by these same wealthy individuals, but they formed it disguised as a bank owned by the state, when in reality it's owned by the wealthy, and it's formed for the benefit of the wealthy. So although the idea of a central bank can be beneficial in managing or balancing the currency, the use of a currency, because back in the 17th to 18th century, particularly in the United States, each bank had its own currency. So you didn't have one standard currency. And this fact that you had hundreds, if not thousands, of different currencies by each bank meant that even somebody without a bank would forge their own currency and pretend that they have a bank and have a currency. So there was a lot of forgery at one time in terms of a national currency, or we wouldn't even call it a national currency, a bank currency, until they standardized and began to have one currency, which they first called the greenback, because the back of it they used green ink. So, anyway, continuing. Here I'm looking at wars for profit. Remember that for over 150 years it has been standard operating procedure for the Rothschilds and their allies to control both sides of every conflict. You must have an enemy if you are going to collect from the king. So these wars, World War I and World War II in particular, are funded by the same people, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds. They funded both sides of a conflict. So Germany was partly funded by the Rockefellers as well as the Allied, the British and so forth. So they made their money basically from both sides. Even up to today they say that war is a very profitable venture for those who finance. Like for example, you have these military industrial complex who sell the arms during a war. That's the best time for them to make money, is when there's a war. So government gives aid to another country in terms of finances to purchase arms, but it's mainly the American companies, these big conglomerates that manufacture these arms. So America might give money to Ukraine to buy arms, but the money doesn't actually leave America because the money is going to the American companies that produce these arms. So the war in Ukraine can be beneficial, profitable for American companies and the American economy in general. So war in that sense is profitable. Anyway, this is the last excerpt. It's from the same book. The same crowd which manipulated the passage of the income tax on the Federal Reserve wanted America in the war, that's World War I. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and the rest of the Jekyll Island conspirators. Jekyll Island is the meeting that they had. I think it's on a property owned by J.P. Morgan. They met and discussed the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank of the US. So it was owned by these private individuals, wealthy individuals. And it was formed to enable them to manipulate the American economy, not just the American economy, but the global economy more efficiently in their eyes. Many of these financiers had loaned England large sums of money. In fact, J.P. Morgan and co. served as British financial agents in this country during World War I, as did the Rockefellers. So that's a look at some of the issues around, some of the things concerning the so-called revolution, communist revolution, and the Bolshevik revolution, and this idea that these international political ideas, now imagine China, which became a communist country, who borrowed an ideology from the West, which he thought was opposing the West, but it was actually promoted by the West. Many global South countries, like many African countries, were looking towards Russia with its socialist ideas, thinking that its socialist ideas were in opposition to what the colonial West, the colonial Western agenda, but in reality this agenda, this Russian socialist agenda, was being pushed or financed by the West in order for them to be able to control both sides of both narratives or both perspectives of the world. Even though if you look at, not just control both narratives, they were promoting the socialist agenda in order to be able to introduce certain aspects of their own agenda into the global South, such as central banks. And the idea of having, I wouldn't say the idea of having one, the central bank was probably the main idea, but the breakdown of the family is an ideology which I didn't think had much effect in the global South, and the breakdown of religion, which is still, I think the promotion of science and technology and the scientific way of doing things, and the promotion of atheism, these are ideologies promoted by the West through intellectual debates and such forth, which they want to influence people's views around the world to turn away from a religious way of thinking, especially the way the world is going now with this transhumanism and the introduction of technology into all aspects of human life, and the introduction of these nanotechnology which can be injected into the human body to monitor the mind or even to influence the mind. Anyway, that's just a look at this globalist agenda and some historical context in terms of how their ideologies have been promoted around the world secretly or covertly. Anyway, that's it for now.